Monday, November 11, 1918, 11:00 a.m. Harlem, New York. Church bells rang across the city to mark the end of the Great War. But inside a cold, narrow apartment on West 131st Street, there was no celebration. Steam pipes knocked like tired bones, and the smell of boiled water filled the room where Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, sat quietly, watching his mother divide a single loaf of bread into careful, embarrassed portions. Outside, men shouted in joy. Inside, hunger kept its own strict silence. Bumpy had learned that silence early. He was born on October 31, 1905, in Charleston, South Carolina, into a black family that worked hard and still came up short. His father labored when work could be found. His mother stretched meals the way other women stretched prayers. Jim Crow laws pressed down on every day of his childhood, and by the time Bumpy could read, he already understood what the world expected from boys like him. Keep your head down, accept less, survive quietly. But Bumpy was never built for quiet. He was small, sharp-eyed, with a quick mind and a temper that flared when he saw injustice. In school, teachers noticed his intelligence before they noticed his fists. He read poetry, memorized words, and asked questions that made adults uncomfortable. Hunger did that. It sharpened you. It made every insult heavier, every unfair rule louder. When his family moved north during the Great Migration, Harlem felt like both a promise and a trap. Black people owned businesses here. Black music poured from windows. But poverty still lived on every staircase. Jobs were scarce, rent was brutal, and respect was something you fought for daily. Bumpy watched men with strong backs come home empty-handed, watched women pawn jewelry to buy coal. He watched his mother skip meals so the children could eat. Those images carved themselves into him deeper than any scar. The streets became his second classroom. On stoops and corners, older boys taught lessons no school would admit existed. How to read danger, how to run messages, how to keep your mouth shut. Bumpy learned fast. He learned that fear was currency, that reputation mattered, and that the law did not protect people like his family. When white policemen shoved black men into patrol wagons for nothing at all, Bumpy memorized their faces. When landlords threatened eviction, he memorized their names. At night, hunger kept him awake. He imagined a future where his mother never had to count slices of bread again. That dream hardened into something darker, not just survival, but control. If the system refused to feed his family, he would find another system. If the world demanded submission, he would answer with strength. By his early teens, trouble followed him like a shadow. He fought back when insulted, refused to bow his head, and gained a reputation as a boy who would not break. after a violent incident involving his sister, and a white man went unpunished by the law. Bumpy's belief in justice collapsed completely. The streets, he realized, had their own rules, and at least those rules were honest. On that November morning in 1918, as Harlem celebrated peace overseas, Bumpy made a quiet promise to himself. He would never let hunger dictate his family's future again. He would never allow them to feel small in a world designed to crush them. Power, he understood even then, was the only language America truly respected. That promise did not sound heroic. It sounded dangerous, and it was. But it was born in empty kitchens, in cold apartments, in a boy's clenched fists. As church bells rang for a victory that had nothing to do with him. This was the beginning, not of a criminal legend, but of a long, ruthless climb out of hunger. Saturday, July 12, 1919, 9:40 p.m. The heat clung to Harlem like a second skin. Gas lamps flickered along Lenox Avenue as Bumpy Johnson leaned against a brick wall, watching the street breathe. Music drifted from basement clubs, dice clicked in alleyways, and money, small but dangerous, changed hands in shadows. This was the Harlem that never made the newspapers. And by 19, Bumpy understood it better than most grown men. He had dropped out of school by then. Not because he lacked intelligence, but because the streets paid faster than patience. His mind was sharp, his memory photographic, and his mouth knew when to stay closed. Older hustlers noticed him, not for his size, but for his calm. Bumpy didn't rush. He listened. He remembered faces, debts, and favors. In Harlem, that made you valuable. His first real work was small. Time running messages, collecting numbers slips, standing lookout while older men handled business. The risk was constant. Police raids were brutal, and beatings came free of charge. But Bumpy learned how to slip away, how to vanish into stairwells, how to make himself forgettable when necessary. Hunger still lived with his family, but now, some nights, he brought home meat instead of excuses. Everything changed the night he met Madame Stephanie St. Clair. She ruled Harlem's numbers, racket with elegance, and iron discipline. A black woman who defied both the Mafia and the police. When Bumpy was brought before her after correcting a runner's stolen payout, she didn't see a punk. She saw potential. He spoke carefully, quoted poetry when she tested him, and never flinched under her stare. St. Clair hired him on the spot. Under her, Bumpy didn't just learn crime. He learned structure, organization, loyalty. He learned that power didn't always come from violence. Sometimes it came from strategy, patience, and knowing exactly when to strike. St. Clair taught him to read contracts, to understand legal loopholes, and to treat business like war conducted in whispers. But Harlem was changing. White gangsters were pushing in, smelling money. Dutch Schultz's men began muscling into black territory, using threats and guns where bribes failed. Violence followed. Bumpy became St. Clair's enforcer. Not the loudest, not the cruelest, but the most effective. When he spoke, people listened. When he moved, problems disappeared. Arrests became routine. Bumpy spent nights in cells that stank of sweat and fear, memorizing badge numbers, studying guards. Jail didn't scare him, it educated him. Each release hardened him, sharpened him. He understood that prison was part of the path, not the end of it. By the mid-1920s, Harlem knew his name. Not loudly, but carefully. He dressed well now, carried himself with confidence, and sent money home regularly. His mother stopped skipping meals. His family's hunger eased, though the memory never left him. He didn't spend wildly. He invested in people, runners, lookouts, lawyers. Respect was his real currency. Violence escalated as the numbers war exploded. Bumpy survived ambushes, betrayals, and near-death encounters. He responded with precision, not rage. Where others reacted emotionally, Bumpy calculated. That made him dangerous. By 1930, he was no longer just a street soldier. He was a lieutenant. Harlem's underworld was beginning to reorganize. And Bumpy Johnson stood at the center of it, educated by hunger, trained by crime, and driven by a promise made years earlier in a cold apartment. The boy who watched his mother divide bread had learned how power really worked, and he was just getting started. Tuesday, March 18, 1931, 60:15 a.m., Sing Sing Prison. The steel doors slammed shut with a finality that echoed down the corridor, and Bumpy Johnson felt the cold settle into his bones. Dawn crept through the narrow window like a weak apology. Outside, Harlem was waking up. Inside, time stopped moving forward and began digging inward. Prison was supposed to break men. It did the opposite to Bumpy. From the first day, he understood the rules. Respect was earned quickly or never at all. He didn't posture. He didn't beg. He watched. He listened. He learned who controlled which tiers, who traded favors for protection, who talked too much. When tested, he responded once, clean, precise, unforgettable. After that, the tests stopped. His reputation followed him through the gates. Guards knew his name. Inmates whispered it. He carried himself with the same calm he'd learned on Harlem corners. But here, calm was currency. Bumpy read constantly, law books, history, poetry. He quoted Shakespeare in the yard and debated strategy with men twice his size. Intelligence became his shield, restraint his weapon. Violence found him anyway. It always did. A dispute over territory on the outside spilled into the mess hall one afternoon. Chairs scraped, fists flew, and knives flashed. Bumpy moved with brutal efficiency, ending the chaos before guards arrived. He didn't brag. He didn't explain. Word traveled faster than blood. From that day on, problems around him had a habit of resolving themselves. Letters came from Harlem, folded thin and cautious. He learned of betrayals, of allies arrested or buried, of numbers' roots shifting hands. Madame Satine. Claire remained defiant, but pressure mounted from every direction. White mobsters tightened their grip, and the police squeezed harder. Bumpy absorbed it all, mapping the city in his head, planning moves he couldn't yet make. Prison had taken his freedom, not his influence. Solitary confinement came and went. Beatings happened off record. Guards tried to provoke him, tried to strip him of dignity. He answered with silence and patience. Each punishment only sharpened his resolve. He memorized routines, exploited weaknesses, and earned quiet favors, extra books, longer yard time, messages passed without questions. Even behind bars, Bumpy built networks. By the mid-1930s, his name carried weight beyond the walls. New inmates arrived already knowing who he was. Some sought protection. Others sought guidance. He gave both selectively. Loyalty mattered. So did discipline. He warned men against reckless violence, against short-term thinking. Crime, he taught, was a business before it was a weapon. On the outside, Harlem burned through another wave of blood. Dutch Schultz's shadow loomed large, and alliances shifted like sand. From his cell, Bumpy understood something others missed. Brute force alone would fail. Power would belong to the man who could negotiate without weakness and strike without hesitation. He prepared himself for that role. When parole hearings came, Bumpy sat straight, spoke carefully, and revealed nothing he didn't need to. He learned the language of authority without believing in it. Each denial only extended his education. Prison had become a laboratory, and he was its most dangerous student. By the time his release approached, Bumpy Johnson was no longer just a street enforcer hardened by hunger. He was a strategist shaped by confinement, a leader refined by pressure. Harlem hadn't seen him in years, but it felt his presence everywhere, in the order that followed chaos, in the quiet. Respect paid to his family, in the rumors that said Bumpy Johnson was coming home different. When the gates finally opened, the man who stepped out carried prison in his eyes and purpose in his stride. He had paid in time and blood, and Harlem was about to feel the return of a mind sharpened by steel and silence. Thursday, September 4th, 1941, 8:30 p.m. Harlem moved to a slower rhythm after dark now, quieter, but heavier with intent. Bumpy Johnson sat in the back room of a Lenox Avenue club, smoke curling above the table like a signal fire. Jazz murmured through the walls. Money lay neatly stacked, untouched. This was no longer the Harlem of reckless gunmen. This was a Harlem run on agreements, understandings, and consequences. Bumpy's release had not been loud, but it was decisive. Within months, he re-established control not through brute force, but through order. Numbers operations stabilized. Street violence dropped, not out of kindness, but because chaos was bad for business. Runners were paid on time. Debts were enforced quietly. Harlem noticed the difference immediately. The Italians noticed too. Meetings with the Mafia happened in neutral spaces. Restaurants, social clubs, private apartments where voices stayed low and hands stayed visible. Bumpy understood the balance. The Italians had infrastructure, political connections, and heroin pipelines. He had Harlem, its streets, its people, its loyalty. Neither side could afford war, so they chose partnership. Bumpy became the bridge. He handled black territory with autonomy, delivering steady profits while keeping police attention manageable. In return, he received protection, access, and a seat at tables no black man had ever been invited to sit at before. He never mistook the relationship for friendship. Respect was conditional. Power always was. Behind the scenes, money flowed faster than ever. Numbers banks expanded. Heroin distribution tightened into efficient routes. The bed was made. Corrupt officials were paid precisely enough to remain helpful, never enough to become careless. Bumpy insisted on discipline. Anyone drawing unnecessary attention was cut loose or corrected. Harlem ran smoother under his invisible hand. And quietly, his family's life changed. His mother moved out of cramped apartments into comfort. Medical bills were handled without worry. Groceries were bought without counting coins. Bumpy never spoke of it publicly, never flaunted wealth. But those close to him understood what it meant. The boy who once watched bread divided into shameful portions had erased hunger from his bloodline. The police knew exactly who was responsible. They raided clubs, stopped runners, leaned on informants. They arrested Bumpy repeatedly, but cases collapsed. Witnesses forgot. Paperwork vanished. Lawyers arrived early and prepared. Bumpy treated jail like a temporary inconvenience, not a threat. Power, he had learned, was insulation. Politicians came calling too. Harlem votes mattered, and Bumpy helped direct them. He supported community figures, funded events, paid rent for struggling families. To some, he was a criminal. To others, he was protection in a city that rarely protected black people. That duality became his shield. Violence didn't disappear, it became purposeful. When lines were crossed, responses were swift and surgical. No public spectacle, no loose ends. Word spread that Bumpy Johnson's Harlem was not to be tested casually. Outsiders learned to ask permission. Insiders learned to follow rules. By the 1950s, his wealth was undeniable, even if unspoken. Cash moved through legitimate fronts. Businesses thrived under quiet backing. Harlem's economy, illegal and otherwise, pulsed to a rhythm Bumpy controlled. He dressed modestly, spoke softly, and commanded rooms without raising his voice. At night alone, he sometimes remembered the hunger, the cold apartments, the promises made to himself as a boy. He had achieved more than survival. He had achieved leverage. But he never forgot the cost. Friends buried. Years lost to prison. Trust rationed carefully. Bumpy Johnson had become something rare and dangerous. A man who understood both the brutality of the streets and the patience of power. Harlem didn't just fear him. It relied on him. And in that quiet reliance, he stood closer than ever to becoming exactly what he had sworn to be, untouchable. Wednesday, July 3, 1968, 4:10 a.m., Wells Restaurant, West 126th Street. The city was half asleep when Bumpy Johnson sat alone at a corner table, a cup of coffee cooling in front of him. Outside, Harlem breathed quietly, unaware that one of its most powerful figures was nearing the end of his long, dangerous climb. The man who once knew hunger better than comfort now, controlled wealth that moved invisibly through New York like a second bloodstream. By the 1960s, Bumpy's name no longer needed introduction. It carried weight in courtrooms, police precincts, and Mafia social clubs. He had outlived rivals who relied on violence alone and surpassed, who mistook greed for strategy. His power came from balance, fear tempered with loyalty, money paired with discipline. Harlem remained largely under his influence, and few dared challenge the order he maintained. His wealth was never flashy, but it was immense. Cash flowed through numbers banks, front businesses, and investments designed to survive scrutiny. He funded lawyers, politicians, and community leaders with the same precision he once funded street crews. Families who had nowhere else to turn found rent paid and heat restored. Churches received donations with no names attached. To many in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson was not just a crime boss. He was stability in a city that often delivered only neglect. Yet age had begun to press in. Prison years had taken their toll. His heart was weaker now, his movements slower. He spoke more, but said less. Younger men watched closely, hoping to inherit pieces of what he had built. But Bumpy trusted few. Power, he knew, could not be handed down easily. It had to be earned through patience, intelligence, and restraint, qualities not easily taught. Law enforcement never stopped trying. Files thickened. Surveillance followed him openly now, almost respectfully. They knew they were running out of time, just as he did. But cases still fell apart. Witnesses disappeared into silence. Harlem closed ranks the way it always had for him, in private moments. Bumpy reflected on the promise he had made decades earlier, in a cold apartment. His family had never gone hungry again. Generations after him would live differently because of the choices he made. Choices carved from desperation, sharpened by prison and refined by power. He had become one of the richest and most influential black men in New York. Not by accident, but by refusing to accept the limits placed on him. That morning at Wells' restaurant, he stirred his coffee slowly, listening to the faint hum of the city waking up. A waitress passed, nodding politely, unaware of the history sitting in her section. Bumpy felt a familiar tightness in his chest, sharper this time. He leaned back, exhaled, and allowed himself one final moment of quiet control. When his heart finally gave out, there was no gunfire, no sirens, no chaos, just stillness. News spread quickly through Harlem, then through New York, then beyond. Reactions were mixed: relief, fear, respect, sorrow. The streets felt different almost immediately. Like a familiar weight had lifted and left an emptiness behind. Bumpy Johnson's death marked the end of an era. Harlem would change. New players would rise, louder and less disciplined. The balance he had maintained would fracture. But his legend remained, rooted not just in crime, but in survival. He had started as a hungry boy, in a world designed to deny him everything. 20 years later, he stood at the top of New York's black underworld, wealthy, feared, and undeniable. History would argue over his morality, but Harlem would remember the truth it lived with. Bumpy Johnson turned hunger into power, and power into a legacy that refused to disappear.